Move now to our featured speaker of the day. It's my honor to introduce Dr. Stephen Morris, who has spent over 20 years in public education as a teacher, vice principal, principal, and superintendent in traditional public schools, charter schools, and private schools. Dr. Morris is described as a transformative servant leader and has spent years serving in diverse and economically challenged communities in rural Fresno County, the city of Fresno, and South Central Los Angeles. Dr. Morris specializes in solving challenging and complex issues regarding equity and diversity in public and private education at primary, secondary, and higher education levels. He has lots of different research and publications, as well as many honors. But currently, and the reason we have him here today and excited about this, he is the co-founder and CEO of the Civic Education Center, which guides public schools to be civically engaged and intentionally inclusive. CEC focuses on training students and teachers in cultural proficiency, restorative practice, the art of civic dialogue, and relevant civic projects servicing the greater community. Something I think that we all need to see more of today. So with that, Dr. Morris, thank you so much for joining us. Looking forward to hearing your presentation. Oh, sorry, we got you on mute.
There we go. Is that better?
Yes, we got you.
During this time of COVID and these technical issues, we've all learned to be gracious with one another with technology. It's just amazing. I was on a call with Bitwise, 500 people, and they had about 30 minutes worth of glitches in technology. So it's everybody, and they're the experts. Thank you again for having me. It's a delight to be back with you guys and share with you. Who would have thought that we would have been experiencing such a year as we did in 2020? It's really interesting. Did you know that now there are 38 million men who sport beards? So razor companies are going to be changing with that. There's also another percentage, because they had barbers, ended up with COVID hairdos. And I have to confess, I had to end up getting my hair done, or else it looked like Frederick Douglass, with my afro sticking all over the place. So end up braiding it back. It's just so interesting when you think about COVID, the humorous side about it is most people just, let go. We had pants that had elastic in them. We got rid of belts, we casual down. And research says that people now on average in America say they have gained COVID weight of approximately 20 pounds. Subnote to that was that they were probably saying it was more than 20, but that's all people would admit to. So if you see some of your friends rolling around that you haven't seen before, be gracious and all of that. So with those things going on, there's also been some really interesting things happening in our nation that you all are aware of that bring this whole idea of civics education to the point of urgency. The things we saw early on with George Floyd kind of galvanized the nation. Everybody saw wrong that was done at that point. And then we saw the violence take place. And we saw the splintering of our nation, the unity that we had going all different ways, and elements coming into this we'd never thought before, challenging our values, challenging, our government itself. We saw the autonomous zones develop, around the country. We saw, defund police. We saw Black Lives Matter. We saw those things happening in our nation. And usually when so many things like that are occurring so close together, it becomes kind of a watershed or moment of change in our history. We last saw this probably as we switched out of the 50s into the 60s with the civil rights movements that dominated our nation, the marches, that bloody Tuesday when all America witnessed for the first time dogs and policemen beating children, senior citizens, others, just because of the color of their skin. And then we saw some of the changes in laws. We saw things happening in the 70s regarding women's rights. And we were taking this now seriously, that women should not be harassed and they should have equal pay as men. There was an equal rights amendment that was floating around in the country to change the Constitution to allow for women to guarantee equal rights and pay and non-harassment. And that kind of faded out. But those changes were there. Those changes in our history are kind of like moments to make us wake up, to look at this idea. Are we truly living according to our values? Our values in America were founded by men who were flawed, but name me someone who isn't flawed, right? They did the best they could with the knowledge that they have to give us something that superseded their abilities and their understanding. And the idea that everyone has been given God-given rights that can't be taken away from them by the church, by government, and those rights are self-evident of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those values all of a sudden become less important, but it's the time that they need to become more important. We saw the storming of the Capitol, and once again, whether you were a Democrat, Republican, or a Libertarian, you saw something that shocked you that wasn't right. And again, we see where our values, I mean, if we really live by these values that we say we hold so dear, then we would expect we would all act in civility with one another. But this problem didn't happen overnight, just like the riots in the 60s and 70s didn't happen overnight. There were things that happened in the 40s and 50s that led up to the 60s. There are things that happened in our country, you know, since the early 90s in regards to testing and public education. We began to try and find a way to develop quality education, and we focus on testing, and things like civics, civility, social emotional learning were pushed to the background. And we saw those changes in our nation as we neglected more and more this idea of teaching US values, that we're all part of this country and that we share these values because we live here. People like to talk about assimilation, they like to talk about differences, but when do we get to talk about the things that make us one? And that's that we live here in this country. We participate in a democracy that is not perfect because it's an institution formed by men, but we are called to make it better. And so at Civic Education, one of the primary things that we do is we go back to those things that have been left out. We go back into the schools and we talk about our founding, the founding of America, and how, yes, there were Native Americans that were totally decimated. Slavery existed. Women didn't have the right to vote. The right to vote was limited to white men who owned property. But those guys at that time were willing to risk their lives on this concept that all men are created equal and all are entitled to access to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the crazy thing about it, these guys, some of them owned slaves, some of them, hated slavery, but they came up with this motto of e pluribus unum. It was the first motto of our country. And in Latin, it means out of many one, because those 13 colonies, there were Baptists, Quakers, Protestants, Methodists, there were slave owners, there were abolitionists, there were free people, but they realized they had to put their differences aside to fight the world's largest power at that time, Britain. And to have any chance of success, these divisions and these differences were going to have to be addressed. We had the first opportunity to address it after the Revolutionary War, when the Articles of Confederation, that government failed. We had our new US Constitution that did not address the issue of slavery directly, but added the clause that made slaves 3/5 of a human being. Now, Madison was behind this compromise because in order to get this country going, they had to agree that they're going to readdress the issue of slavery in 20 years. Now, that was in 1789, and it didn't get addressed. We saw problems that happened in 1820 and 1850 and 1857 with the Dred Scott decision, with more states coming on board in the country, the Fugitive Slave Act that forced Northerners who hated slavery to turn over slaves to Southern slave masters. A little thirsty there. And that action in the 1850s propelled this nation to really decide, are we going to live according to our values, that all men are created equal, or are we going to allow slavery to continue? And it was Abraham Lincoln who finally said that we realize the issue of our division in our nation, excuse me, has to do with God visiting judgment on this nation because of the blood and sweat of every slave that ever existed in this country. And he said this terrible disaster visited upon us, the Civil War, is a direct cause of the providence of God because we have not lived up to our values. So we go into schools and we talk about our values. We talk about the Civil War. We talk about 100 years later, or not even 100 years later, after the Civil War in 1919, women finally get the right to vote. We talk about a nation who believed that all people are created equal, had to extend that to women and former slaves and give them the right to vote. And it's interesting that the women's movement celebrated its 100th anniversary last year when that amendment was passed, but the protests were brutal. Women were beaten, thrown in jail. They were beaten by their husbands, fathers, and brothers who told them that you need to keep quiet, you have no rights to speak. But the women understood, and most in our country did too, that these values that everyone, regardless of race or gender, is entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Our nation fought wars around the world to help people gain access to the things that we hold dearly of those values. The greatest generation that fought in World War II and came back went to end worldwide intolerance and racism, not just against Jews, but gypsies, against anyone that the Nazis considered inferior. African American soldiers fought in that war. And it's interesting that during that war, Nazis dropped leaflets and pamphlets to African American soldiers in English saying, why will you fight for a country who doesn't accept you when you go back home? That's always been a sore spot in our country, but it's also a gift to us. When we have these values, it gives us an opportunity to examine ourselves and examine, do we really mean what we say? What happened in the 40s and the 50s led up to the civil rights movement of the 60s, where our greatest generation saw this inconsistency and others joined in and thought there had to be a change in our nation. And again, we came back to our values. Women's rights, an issue in the 70s again. We are constantly looking at, can we live up to the true meaning of our values? We had the environmental issue come out in the 80s and 90s, dealing with pollution and climate change. And it's interesting, it doesn't matter what side of the aisle you're on, whether you believe climate change is man-made or whether it's natural, we all are beginning to see that it's happening, regardless of the cause. And so now we see environmental issues where people are lacking the ability to have quality access to air and water. Health issues are on the rise and increasing. And we ask ourselves, do we live in a land where everyone is valued and they have access to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? And our schools are teaching math and they're teaching English and they're teaching reading, and those things are wonderful. But why are they not doing as Thomas Jefferson envisioned in our public school systems, to educate a populace that would forever hold government accountable? We lack teaching civics and civility in our schools, and our students have no idea what it is to exercise a right to vote or live in a society, a democratic society. I was talking to a group of college students almost 8-9 months ago, and my grandson was one of them, and they're talking about that totalitarianism may be better than democracy because things would be done. Now, who would ever have thought that a group of college students would ever talk about a form of change of government in America? And that's because they haven't been taught that we value these things. We haven't been consistent in living them out, but we value them and we're willing to change based on those values that we saw in the Civil War, that we saw in the Civil Rights Movement, we saw in the women's movement. We see that America is willing to struggle and live out those values. So when we go in schools, we go in and we talk to kids about those values first and foremost. We talk to 5th graders through 12th graders. And they begin to see that America does have something worth living for, that these values are important enough to die for, that we saw in the Revolutionary War. A lot of those men were killed. 13 of the founding fathers were killed by the British as traitors and hung. We saw people die in the Civil War. Between 650,000 and 800,000 Americans were killed fighting for this idea that will we live up to the true meaning of our values? We see Martin Luther King in dozens of his speeches calling America to task, not as hating America, but saying that this greatest country on the earth that has democracy needs to live up to the true meaning of its creed, that all men are created equal and all men are guaranteed these rights. So when we talk to students about that, you see their eyes light up and you see them begin to think, well, what does that mean today? And we ask one simple question: look around you, who do you see who's not living or has access to life, liberty, and a lifestyle that would make them comfortable and happy? And the kids start talking about bullying in their school. They talk about mental health issues. They talk about race. They talk about immigration. They talk about these things that we're struggling with in our nation right now. And it's so cool because as they're talking, we show the Great Seal of the United States. And for most of us who don't remember that, that's on the back of our dollar bill. There are two sides. There's an unfinished pyramid and there's an eagle. And as the kids are talking, we say, look at this symbol. This is what represents the United States. What do you see? They named the eagle mighty, powerful, and brave with eyesight that can see over 20 miles away and can dive straight down to catch its prey over 100 miles an hour. They see the eagle looking at an olive branch. They see the eagle and the other talent, arrows. And we say, what does that mean? And they think about it, says, well, you mean to fight, but you want peace. That's exactly right. America's priorities with the eagle facing the olive branch is about peace, not war. But we have the arrows in our hands to say, if you challenge our values, if you challenge what we believe, we will fight. And the kids think about that. What are issues they're willing to fight for? And then we say, now, look at the other side, the Great Pyramid. It's not finished. At the bottom of that pyramid are Roman numerals, and we talk about how if they were in school, 100 years ago, they would learn Latin, which they don't do today. And it says the year 1776. That's the foundation year on that pyramid when America was founded. It was starting democracy. There were no democracies in the world at that time, brand new. And above it, they have the words where God is favoring our endeavor. And below it, it is that a new change is occurring in the world, the bringing of the democracy. And the pyramid is there because they wanted a symbol that would last forever. But why didn't they finish the pyramid? Because each generation has the responsibility to perfect this union. Each generation. They did it in 1776. They did it in the 1860s. They did in the 1920s, giving women the right to vote. They did in 1965, again, dealing with civil rights. They did with women's issues in the 70s and environmental issues in the 80s. Our country is willing to say, we will live up to these values, but who's going to help us and see that and make that happen? So that's what we do in schools. And then kids see this and they talk about those issues and they say, what can we learn about it? And so they do research from multiple perspectives, not just one, not a Democrat, not a Libertarian, not a Republican, but what is the objective research say on this topic? They talk to librarians and then they get together and they have a big class-wide dialogue. And in that dialogue, not a debate, and I said this earlier, they dialogue their differences because a debate is to prove one person wrong and one person right. We want you to discuss and have common dialogue on what you prefer. And after they choose what they prefer, a project, whether it's working with the mental health issues with teens, with their families and with issues like that, or whether it's environment, cleaning up the river or the lake, they do stuff like that. And it's all student driven. The students come up with the idea. Then sometimes it means they're working with government agencies and they learn about the processes of our government. They learn how that sometimes in a democracy, you don't always get what you want, but you can work for the common good. And the last thing I'll share before I give it questions, I know I went a little bit long here, I get excited about this stuff, is that I was working with a group of high school kids in Sanger. There were about 39, 40 kids in this class, and they had been talking these issues and studying them, and it came down to two projects. Police abuse and violence against people by law enforcement, and teen suicide. So those were the two issues that remained that they were talking about. We call it a continuum. We give students a chance to change sides as they talk about why they choose one side or the other. And this side over here talked about grandparents being stopped by police, being harassed by police, being put in fear by police, and they had stories of family members. And the other side had stories about teens and family members that they knew that had attempted suicide, that were struggling with depression. And as they talked back and forth, more students were coming over on this side. They were concerned about their peers. We ended up with 4 students over here. And in a democracy, the majority wins. But this will blow your mind. That majority that won and their issue became a class topic walked over to those group of 4 students and they said, your idea is important too. And maybe next time we could do that. Can you imagine if America, in our democracy, if we practice what those high school students did, that we don't gloat and boast over victory because we have the majority, but we go to those who were the minority and say to them, you have a cause worth being heard too. Can you imagine how that would change our democracy? So that's what we do. We go into schools and we do this. We had 1,600 kids involved in our program before the pandemic hit. Now we have about 300 to 400. We did over 62,000 hours of projects with these 1,600 kids that, again, range from everything from creating websites to help agencies know about teen mental health issues, rape, immigration issues, family domestic violence and abuse, and what they could do to help in that. And so these kids come out as many experts in each one of these things, and they feel this sense of empowerment because they understand how our democracy works and how they can make changes in their country. So that's what we do. I'm sorry I went a little bit long. I ask you to forgive me on that.
No problem whatsoever, Dr. Morris. Appreciate the conversation there. Let me kick it off with, where do you see social media's role in civic education today? I mean, I'm assuming it's not helping the cause, even though it has the potential to do so. Where do we see the next generation and how that could possibly, we could turn that around and to play more of a role?
Actually, the thing that we're seeing more that's social media has helped with some of the causes as these students do their research and they bring in experts, like we brought in a couple of attorneys and police officers to talk to students to help them inform on their opinion and projects, but it all came through social media and contact. Somebody's father knew somebody and they made the contact and brought it in. My concern with social media is that when you have West or Germany and China saying that our companies are censoring here in America, our tech companies are, that concerns me because we have a First Amendment right to speak and we have a First Amendment right that needs to be expressed with our values. And so as long as social media can remain really objective, I think it's a real strong tool that works for our teens and works for our kids. And maybe it's going to take another generation because we haven't taught civics. We haven't taught this in our schools because it's been put to the wayside over there. And so now we're looking at 30 years later of no civics, and we have riots and we have people acting without understanding what our values are or what they're doing. So I think social media has a role, but I think that role will be defined more as we understand our own rights and support each other in that.
A question that just came across, Dr. Morris, I think is very important to be discussing. Do you have any recommendations of books that do a good job of enlightening us about this history? For example, the recent biography of Frederick Douglass.
That's a good book, but Frederick Douglass has at least 3 autobiographies written during his lifetime. A couple of good books would be Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in a Cafeteria? As a phenomenal book because it gets into the issue of race and race identity in our schools. Another good book, if you're leaning more towards the evangelical issue, would be Daniel Hill's book, White Awake. And it talks about the church's role in racism throughout the 1500s until today. Did you know it was a couple of popes, Gregory, Alexander, and Nicholas, that issued papal decrees that defined race in the Western Hemisphere and in Africa? And most people don't realize Christianity has been used in a negative way to propagate a false idea of race. So those are a couple of good ones. Post-traumatic slave syndrome is really good. Stamped, that was on one of Oprah Winfrey's books that she talked about is excellent. those are some ones off the top of my head that I've read that have been really informative.
And then this is a last question I'll ask here, but I think it's relevant. How do we get back to discussing politics at the dinner table? And I say dinner table post pandemic life and everything else, but not talking about politics has not been good for this country, or at least in my perspective, has not been good. Getting away from that, respectable dialogue, I think, is hurting this country.
Yes, and a lot of that is because of the partisanship that's taking place in our politics, because we haven't talked about civility or the purpose of dialogue, not debate. Oftentimes at the dinner table, it happened at our house too, the conversation switches to a debate where one is trying to prove the other wrong, rather than how do we inform each other and learn from each other. So if we can understand what it is to have civil dialogue with one another, we can switch this conversation. And my hope that now the election is over, the reasons that most people had to be partisan will end, and we can start working together and engage in dialogue and talk about some of these difficult issues like students are doing in our schools.
Well, fantastic. Dr. Morris, thank you so much. Really appreciate you joining us today. Virtual round of applause. Really enlightening discussion, particularly with the current events that we've been having going on for the past year. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, one more thing, if I may.
Yeah, please.
Since schools are having trouble funding, they're having trouble funding us. If you guys ever want a project to support, we're in need of that. Our kids are developing some major projects right now. And if you guys want an organization that focuses on understanding those values in American government, hey, give us a look at our website is civicedcenter.org, civicedcenter.org. And there you can see some of the projects kids have done, see what we stand for, and maybe even throw $1 or $2 our way. We'd be most appreciative of that.
Well, fantastic. Thank you. So actually, let me ask you this. Somebody just asked, are you a 501c3?
Yes, we are a 501c3.
There you go, Lynn. So thank you so much. Appreciate you once again for being here today.
Thank you. My pleasure. You guys have a good one.